The courtroom was suffocating, not because of the size, but because of the air of arrogance, the smirks, and the quiet laughter echoing from the group of rookie cops standing near the prosecutor's table. They weren't even trying to hide it. The way they looked at the black woman sitting alone at the defense table, the way they exchanged glances, nudging each other, suppressing their amusement, it was the look of men who believed they had already won. The trial hadn't even begun, but for them, this wasn't a courtroom seeking justice. It was a stage set for humiliation, and she was their entertainment. "Damn, she looks scared as hell," one of them whispered, chuckling. "Like a deer in headlights," another added, shaking his head, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Poor thing, probably never even seen a courtroom before. She's about to learn how the real world works," a third one chimed in, leaning back with his arms crossed. "Think she's gonna cry when they read the verdict?" Their laughter was low but filled with cruelty, the kind that didn't need volume to cut deep. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they said them, the absolute certainty that this woman, this black woman, was powerless. They had seen it before. A public defender probably assigned last minute. Maybe she barely spoke English. Maybe she had a record. Maybe she was just another statistic, another life they could break without consequences. They weren't just expecting her to lose. They were enjoying it. The judge hadn't entered yet. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the smirk of someone who knew the system was built in his favor, leaned toward the group. "Relax, boys. This is gonna be over quick. I've seen these types before. They never stand a chance. The jury's already set, and you know how it goes." The rookie cops grinned. This was normal to them. A game. Another easy win. The woman at the defense table hadn't moved. She sat still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes lowered. To an outsider, she might have looked nervous, overwhelmed, even defeated. But those who were paying attention, those who weren't blinded by their own arrogance, might have noticed the way she breathed steadily, the way she didn't flinch, the way she seemed to be listening, waiting. The door to the judge's chamber creaked open. Everyone straightened. The room adjusted itself to authority. The bailiff stepped forward, clearing his throat. "All rise for the honorable," and then, the impossible happened. The woman at the defense table stood. She didn't just stand, she straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and turned to face the entire room. "Actually," she said, her voice calm, precise, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "You may all remain seated." For a second, there was silence. A strange, confused silence. The rookie cops blinked. The prosecutor frowned. The audience shifted, exchanging glances. "What?" One of the rookies let out a nervous laugh, looking around as if waiting for someone to correct her. "You don't get to talk yet." "I do," she interrupted, taking a step forward. The prosecutor, now visibly irritated, slammed his folder on the table. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this is a court of law. You don't speak unless—" "I speak whenever I see injustice," she said sharply, her gaze piercing through him. "And right now, that means speaking before this trial even begins." Something shifted in the room. The rookies, once so full of amusement, were now stiff, their grins fading into confusion. The prosecutor opened his mouth to protest, but something about the way she held herself, something about the certainty in her eyes, made him pause. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small black leather case. She flipped it open, held it up for all to see. That's when the color drained from the prosecutor's face. That's when the rookie cops stopped breathing. That's when the courtroom, once filled with arrogance and laughter, turned deathly silent. Because inside that small black leather case was a gold badge. And stamped across the top, in bold, undeniable letters, were the words United States Federal Judge. The prosecutor stumbled back as if he had been struck. The rookies, who had just moments ago been reveling in their own cruelty, now looked like deer in headlights. "I am judge of the United States District Court," she continued, her voice unwavering, filled with the weight of authority. "And before we proceed any further, I would like to know why a courtroom under my jurisdiction is operating under such blatant corruption." No one spoke. The prosecutor looked at the bailiff looked at the jury looked at the rookie cops, and the rookie cops. They looked like they wanted to disappear. "Something to say?" she asked, turning her gaze toward them. One of them, the one who had been laughing the loudest, opened his mouth, but no words came out. She took a step closer. "No." "Then allow me." Her eyes swept across the room. "Because I have a very clear understanding of what's been happening here. The racial profiling. The rigged juries. The falsified evidence. The forced confessions. The officers who believe their badge puts them above the law." The prosecutor was sweating now. "I have spent my career fighting against corruption," she continued. "And yet, today, I walk into my own courtroom, only to be greeted by a group of officers mocking what they thought was another defenseless black woman about to be swallowed by the system." She tilted her head, letting the words sink in. "Tell me, how does it feel to realize you're the ones who are actually on trial?" The silence was deafening. The prosecutor, once so smug, was gripping the edge of his table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The rookies, who had once laughed with such certainty, now looked like men who had just realized their world was collapsing. But this was only the beginning. Because what happened next? That left everyone in the courtroom completely shocked. Before we start this story, we want to make something very clear: Plow of Twist stands firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. This channel is a place where powerful stories unfold, where justice prevails, and where voices that have been silenced for too long are finally heard. To every black viewer watching this, you are seen, you are valued, and you are powerful. Your story matters. Now, get ready for an emotional, dramatic, and unforgettable journey. Enjoy the story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible twists. The courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama, was an old structure, heavy with history, its walls lined with the weight of past injustices. The smell of polished oak and old paper filled the air, a scent that carried the whispers of 1,000 cases before this one. The courtroom itself was grand but suffocating, a place where power was wielded, often in favor of those who already had it. Today, it was set to host yet another trial, another case where the outcome had been decided long before the defendant had even stepped through the heavy wooden doors. At least, that's what the people in control thought. At the center of it all sat Camille Warren, composed and still. She was a black woman in her mid-40s, elegant and poised in a navy blue blazer that fit her like armor. Her hair was styled in soft waves that framed her sharp features, her deep brown eyes revealing nothing. She had the kind of presence that demanded attention without a single word, though no one in the room seemed to notice. Or rather, no one wanted to acknowledge it. To them, she was just another defendant, another black woman caught up in a system designed to break her. The room had already made up its mind about her. They saw what they wanted to see, a powerless figure awaiting judgment. Camille had spent a lifetime in rooms like these. She had walked through doors where she wasn't wanted, had felt the weight of eyes watching her, doubting her, underestimating her. But she had also spent a lifetime proving them wrong. What none of these men knew, what none of them even considered, was that Camille had built her career dismantling men just like them. She knew how they operated, how they twisted the law to fit their own agenda, how they weaponized their badges and their power to crush those they saw as beneath them. They were so used to getting away with it that the very idea of consequences had become foreign to them. That would change today. The rookie cops lined up on the prosecution's side were easy to read. Young, overconfident, eager to impress the higher-ups. They were fresh out of training, but they had already learned the rules of the game, when to laugh at the right jokes, when to keep quiet, when to let things slide. They had been taught how the system worked, and more importantly, how it worked for them. Officer Brent Carter, the one with the loudest laugh, had the build of a man who had been an athlete in high school, someone used to having the world handed to him. His short blonde hair was always perfectly combed, his uniform neatly pressed, as if he believed appearance was enough to make him respectable. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Then there was Officer Shane Fuller, the youngest of the group, his dark eyes filled with an arrogance that came not from experience, but from belief. Belief that he was untouchable, that he was on the winning team. He wasn't as loud as Brent, but he was just as cruel, his words always a little sharper, his insults laced with something personal. He enjoyed seeing people squirm. And then there was Officer Tyler Graves, quieter than the others, but just as dangerous. He was the kind who didn't need to say much, his presence alone was enough. He was the one who watched, who assessed, who made sure things went the way they were supposed to. He had the look of a man who had already decided Camille's fate before she even walked through the doors. The prosecutor, Douglas Hayward, was a veteran in the courtroom, a man who had spent decades ensuring the system stayed exactly as it was. His graying hair and tailored suit gave him an air of credibility, but the smirk on his face revealed everything one needed to know. He had seen cases like this before. He knew how they ended. He had worked this courtroom long enough to know that no jury in Montgomery was going to side with a black woman over a group of young, promising police officers. To him, this case was nothing more than a formality. The judge, Richard Calloway, sat high above them, an older white man with deep lines across his face, each one marking another year spent maintaining the status quo. He was well respected, not because he was just, but because he was predictable. He ran his courtroom with an iron fist, always favoring order over fairness. The system had rewarded him for it. He was known for his harsh sentences, his zero-tolerance policies, things that made him a hero in certain circles. He was the kind of judge who believed that justice was best served when it was swift and unforgiving. And today, he was set to deliver yet another one of those rulings. The tension in the room was thick, the kind that settled deep into the bones. There was an unspoken rule in places like this: black people were not meant to win. The police officers knew it. The prosecutor knew it. Even the jury, hand-selected to ensure a certain kind of verdict, knew it. Camille could feel their eyes on her, the silent judgment, the expectation that she would fold under the weight of it all. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. She sat quietly as they whispered about her, as they laughed at her expense. She let them think they had already won. She let them believe that she was just another case, just another life they could ruin without consequence. Because they didn't know. They didn't know that every word, every smirk, every assumption they made about her was sealing their own fate. Camille had spent years fighting battles in rooms just like this one. She had faced men who thought they were above the law, who thought their power made them untouchable. She had seen what happened when people like them were given too much authority, when they believed they would never be held accountable. She had seen the damage they caused, the lives they destroyed, the families they tore apart. But she had also seen something else: what happened when they were exposed, when the truth was brought into the light. She had come here today not as a defendant, not as a woman pleading for mercy, but as a force of reckoning. And they had no idea. As the courtroom settled, as Judge Calloway prepared to start the proceedings, Camille took one last glance at the rookies who had been so certain of their victory. She saw the way they grinned at each other, the way they nudged each other like this was some kind of game. And for the first time since she had walked through those doors, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. They thought they were in control. They thought they had already won. But what none of them knew, what none of them even suspected, was that the real trial was about to begin. And they were the ones who would be judged. The courtroom was alive with an undercurrent of tension, a silent war of gazes and unspoken words stretching between Camille Warren and the men who had made it their mission to break her. The rookies, still believing in their invincibility, sat with casual arrogance, their bodies relaxed but their eyes filled with expectation. They had no reason to fear this trial; in their minds, it was a mere formality. Their confidence was almost laughable, They thought they had already won. Douglas Hayward, ever the composed prosecutor, adjusted his tie and stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the courtroom floor. He didn't even spare Camille a glance as he addressed the judge, his tone drenched in a smug assurance that grated against the silence. He had prosecuted hundreds of cases, stood in this very courtroom 1,000 times before. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his demeanor. He wasn't just prosecuting today, he was performing. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth, well-rehearsed. The state is prepared to proceed. This is a straightforward case, one that requires no theatrics, no unnecessary delays. We have the evidence, the testimony, and the integrity of these fine officers who serve this city. His lips curled slightly, the ghost of a smirk playing at the edges. And we have, of course, a defendant who wishes to claim otherwise. Camille didn't react. She let his words settle in the air, let them fester in the ears of everyone in the room. She knew this strategy. He wanted to frame the narrative before she had the chance to speak, to paint the picture before she could even lift the brush. He wanted her to be nothing more than a shape in the background of his carefully constructed story. The judge nodded, barely looking up from his papers. Proceed. Hayward turned on his heel and faced the jury, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced slowly. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not complicated. It is about respect for the law. It is about ensuring that those who break the law, those who think they are above it, face the consequences of their actions. He stopped, turning sharply to face Camille, his expression suddenly sterner. It is about holding even those who believe they can manipulate the system accountable. Camille's lips twitched. The irony of his words was almost too much to bear. Hayward gestured toward the rookies, who straightened in their seats, their expressions instantly shifting into something more somber, more controlled. These officers, fresh to the force, dedicated to their duty, were merely doing their jobs. They had every reason to believe that their actions were justified. And yet, they have been called here today, their integrity questioned, because someone refuses to take responsibility for their own mistakes. Camille tilted her head, finally allowing herself to meet Hayward's gaze head-on. His smirk faltered for half a second. It was brief, nearly imperceptible, but she caught it. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not in a way that made him uncomfortable. He thrived on power imbalances, on the confidence that the system would always favor him. And for years, it had. But today, Camille wasn't here to play by his rules. The first witness was called, Officer Brent Carter. He stepped up to the stand with an air of ease, his uniform crisp, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was eager to tell his version of the story. He took the oath, then settled into his seat, hands folded in front of him. His face was carefully composed, but there was a spark in his eyes, the kind that belonged to men who had never known real consequence. Hayward stepped closer, offering Carter an encouraging nod. Officer Carter, in your own words, can you walk us through the events of that evening? Carter straightened, his voice steady, rehearsed. Yes, sir. My unit was on patrol when we received a report of suspicious activity in the area. We were informed that an individual matching the description of the defendant was behaving erratically, possibly under the influence of narcotics. He cleared his throat, glancing toward the jury as if ensuring they were following. Upon arrival, we observed the defendant loitering near a storefront. When approached, she became agitated, uncooperative, and refused to provide identification. Given her behavior and the circumstances, we were left with no choice but to detain her for further questioning. Camille leaned back slightly in her chair, watching him, absorbing every word. There it was. The carefully woven lie. The deliberate framing of the situation to justify what they had done. She could see the way Hayward was nodding, the way the jury was absorbing Carter's words like gospel. They wanted to believe him. They always wanted to believe them. Hayward turned, his expression serious. Did you or any of your fellow officers use excessive force at any point during this encounter? Carter's expression didn't change. Absolutely not. And did you have any reason to believe that the defendant was acting in a manner that could be considered a threat? Yes, sir. She was non-compliant, erratic in her responses, and refused lawful orders. There it was again. The same tired narrative. The dangerous black woman. The aggressive suspect. The uncooperative criminal. It was the script they always used, the one that had been rehearsed so many times it had become second nature. Hayward stepped back, satisfied. No further questions. The judge turned to Camille. Defense? Slowly, she stood, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from her blazer. She took her time, letting the silence fill the room, letting the anticipation grow thick. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate. Officer Carter, she began, you stated that you received a report of suspicious activity. Could you clarify exactly who made that report? Carter hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was an anonymous call. Camille nodded as if considering this. An anonymous call. No description of what this suspicious activity was, other than the fact that it involved a black woman standing near a storefront. Hayward shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. Carter's mouth pressed into a thin line. We responded based on the information given. Camille took a slow step forward. And when you arrived, did you witness this woman committing a crime? Carter hesitated again, but his pride wouldn't let him falter. As I said, she was acting erratically. She arched a brow. Erratically, as in standing quietly. Carter's jaw clenched. Camille tilted her head. Or erratically, as in not immediately obeying a command from a man who had no legal grounds to detain her. The silence in the room shifted. The jury was listening now. The cracks in the prosecution's story were beginning to form. Camille took another step. Tell me, Officer Carter, did you know who I was before you arrested me? He didn't answer immediately. Camille's lips curved slightly. Because I think we both know that if you had, you would have handled that night very differently. Carter swallowed. Camille let the weight of her words settle over the courtroom before she finally stepped back. No further questions. She sat down, crossing her legs, her expression unreadable. But inside, she could feel it, the unraveling. The slow, inevitable collapse of their carefully constructed lie. And this was just the beginning. The tension in the courtroom was no longer just an undercurrent, it was a suffocating force, pressing down on everyone in the room. The confidence that had once filled the faces of the rookie cops had begun to crack, the smirks replaced by tightening jaws and shifting eyes. The jury, once comfortably passive, was now leaning forward, absorbing every word, realizing that what had seemed like a routine case was anything but. Judge Calloway, normally unreadable, adjusted in his seat, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest, the only sign that he too sensed the shift in the room. Douglas Hayward, for the first time since the trial began, looked less sure of himself. His well-rehearsed script was unraveling, piece by piece, thread by thread, and Camille Warren wasn't just pulling at it, she was setting it on fire. She sat poised at the defense table, the weight of the moment reflected in her stillness. She had spent her entire career waiting for an opportunity like this, a moment where the corruption embedded in the system would be laid bare, not behind closed doors, not through whispered settlements, but here, in the light, where no one could deny it. The final piece of evidence was waiting to be introduced. It had remained untouched on the table beside her, an unassuming file that carried enough weight to bring down everyone sitting across from her. But she let it rest there, untouched, because there was one more move to make before she played her final card. She stood, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached the witness stand. Brent Carter was still seated there, his body no longer as relaxed as it had been earlier. His hands were gripping the arms of his chair, his posture stiff. His eyes followed her as she stepped closer, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle twitch beneath his skin. Officer Carter, Camille said, her voice steady, unwavering, "You testified that my behavior was erratic. That I refused to comply with your orders, that I posed a potential threat." His lips pressed together, his eyes darting toward Hayward as if searching for an escape. "Yes," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had before. Camille nodded, allowing a pause, letting the weight of the question settle over the room. "Tell me," she continued, "at what point, during your detainment of me, did you run my identification through your system?" Carter hesitated, just for a breath, but it was enough. Camille tilted her head. "You didn't, did you?" Carter's fingers curled against the armrest, his throat moving in a hard swallow. He stopped himself, inhaled sharply. "We had probable cause to detain you before identification was necessary." "Probable cause," Camille repeated slowly. "And yet, at no point did you verify who I was." She took a step closer, lowering her voice just slightly. "You didn't verify because you didn't think you needed to, because you had already decided who I was, based on nothing more than the color of my skin." Hayward stood abruptly. "Objection," Camille turned sharply, her voice cutting through his. "Sit down, Mr. Hayward." The shock that rippled through the room was visible. No one spoke to Hayward that way. Not in this courtroom, not in front of this judge. But Camille wasn't just anyone. Hayward's face darkened, but he hesitated, waiting for the judge to reprimand her. When no such thing happened, his jaw tightened, and he lowered himself stiffly back into his chair. Camille turned back to Carter. "You didn't know who I was that night, Officer Carter. But you know now, don't you?" She reached for the file at her table, lifting it slowly, deliberately. "This," she said, flipping it open, "is my personnel file. Would you like to read my title aloud for the court?" Carter remained silent, his face draining of color. Camille stepped closer, holding the file out toward him. "Go ahead," she said, her voice deceptively gentle. "Read it." Carter's fingers barely brushed the edge of the file before he pulled his hand back as if it had burned him. Camille's eyes locked onto his. "I am Judge Camille Warren, appointed by the United States District Court, overseeing federal jurisdiction." She let the words sink in, watching as realization dawned across every face in the room. "You detained and humiliated a sitting federal judge under false pretenses. You falsified reports, manipulated evidence, and attempted to push through a conviction on the basis of fabricated claims." Hayward shot to his feet again. "Your Honor, this is outrageous, this is the truth," Camille interrupted, her voice sharp, commanding. She turned back to Carter. "Tell me, Officer Carter, what happens when an officer is found guilty of unlawful arrest, falsification of evidence, and perjury in a court of law?" Carter's hands were trembling now. Camille turned, her gaze sweeping over the other rookies, Fuller, Graves, all of whom were visibly shaken, the confidence they once carried stripped away entirely. "You wanted a conviction today," she said, her voice quiet but lethal. "But the only convictions happening in this courtroom will be yours." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, the reality settling in. Camille turned toward the judge, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor," she said, "in light of this evidence, I motion to dismiss all charges against me and open an immediate investigation into the conduct of these officers and their involvement in systemic racial profiling." Judge Calloway, who had remained silent throughout it all, exhaled slowly. His fingers drummed against the desk, his gaze shifting toward Hayward, whose face was red with fury, with fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge nodded. Motion granted. Camille inhaled, steadying herself as the room erupted into chaos. The jury, the spectators, the officers at the back, all of them murmuring, whispering, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Hayward turned toward the rookies, his expression one of sheer panic, knowing what was coming next. Camille had set everything into motion, and now, there was nothing he could do to stop it. The real trial had just begun. And this time, the system wouldn't protect them. The weight of what had just happened hung thick in the air, suffocating and inescapable. The courtroom was no longer a place of quiet confidence for those who had walked in thinking they owned it. Now, it felt like a pressure chamber, filled with the silent panic of men who had spent their entire lives believing they were untouchable, only to realize, in real time, that their power was slipping through their fingers. Brent Carter's face was rigid, his jaw locked so tight it looked painful. His fingers twitched against the arm of the witness stand, as if itching to reach for something, control, authority, anything to reverse what was happening. But there was nothing. His badge wouldn't protect him here. His uniform wouldn't shield him. His training had never prepared him for this moment, for the suffocating awareness that, for the first time, the law wasn't bending in his favor. Camille Warren didn't look away from him, didn't blink. She watched him unravel, watched as he struggled to hold on to whatever composure he had left. But it was useless. He knew it. And more importantly, so did everyone else. The murmurs in the gallery were growing, rising like a tide. The people sitting in those benches had seen countless trials before, had watched this courtroom operate under the same unspoken rules for years. And now, they were witnessing something they had never expected, a system cracking open from the inside. Judge Calloway's gavel slammed against the wood. Order. His voice cut through the chaos, sharp, impatient. He had no choice but to acknowledge what was unfolding, no way to bury it. Not when Camille Warren had made it impossible. Douglas Hayward was livid. His carefully composed demeanor had shattered, replaced with barely restrained fury. His face was flushed, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He was a man drowning, grasping at anything that might keep him afloat. Your Honor, he started, his voice strained, desperate, this entire proceeding has been hijacked by theatrics. The defendant, Judge Warren, Camille corrected smoothly, her voice calm, lethal. Hayward's eyes snapped to hers, the muscle in his jaw jumping. Judge Warren, he spat, his words clipped, tight, is manipulating this courtroom. She is using her position to undermine a legitimate case, a case built on lies, Camille interjected, stepping forward, closer to the center of the room. A case fabricated by officers who assumed no one would question their authority. Hayward's hands curled into fists. You were detained under reasonable suspicion. Suspicion of what? Camille cut in sharply, her voice laced with something colder now, something razor-sharp. Existing while black. Standing in a public space without your approval. Not lowering my head the second a badge was flashed in my face. The words sent a ripple through the room. Even Calloway, despite his tight-lipped expression, shifted uncomfortably. Camille let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle in the bones of every single person who had sat in that courtroom thinking this trial would be routine. Her eyes flickered back to Carter. You arrested me without cause, she said, her voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. You falsified reports to justify your actions. You stood in this courtroom, under oath, and lied. Carter's throat bobbed. He had nothing left to say. No way to spin this. He knew it, and so did his fellow officers. Shane Fuller, who had sat so smugly just minutes ago, now looked pale, his hands gripping his thighs like they were the only things keeping him grounded. Tyler Graves, normally the quietest, had the look of a man calculating his escape, but there was nowhere to go. The courtroom was a trap of their own making, and Camille had sealed the doors. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, she said evenly, I move to have all charges against me formally dismissed with prejudice, and for an immediate investigation into the actions of Officers Carter, Fuller, and Graves to begin. Judge Calloway exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His gaze flickered toward Hayward, toward the officers, then back to Camille. He knew what this meant. Knew that whatever he decided would set a precedent, would send ripples beyond these walls. Hayward saw it too. He saw the hesitation, the wavering, and he lunged for it. Your Honor, he said quickly, his tone shifting, softening, trying to claw back control, surely we can handle this matter through internal review. There's no need to escalate, Camille laughed. It was quiet, humorless, cutting. Internal review, she repeated, tilting her head slightly. You mean the same internal review that has cleared men like these of wrongdoing for decades? The same internal review that buries misconduct, that silences victims, that allows officers to continue their careers unchecked? Hayward flinched, just slightly, but enough. Camille's gaze sharpened. No, she said, final, absolute. This does not disappear into bureaucratic limbo. Not this time. Judge Calloway stared at her for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, nodded. Motion granted. The words slammed through the courtroom like a shockwave. Hayward paled. Carter closed his eyes. Fuller let out a shaky breath. Graves clenched his fists, his entire body rigid with disbelief. Charges against Judge Warren are dismissed with prejudice, Calloway announced, his voice firm, final. An official misconduct inquiry will be launched immediately against officers Carter, Fuller, and Graves. Court is adjourned. The gavel slammed down. And just like that, the case that had started as a farce, as a power play by corrupt men who thought they owned the system, had become their own undoing. Camille remained still, letting it sink in, letting the reality settle over the room. Hayward turned toward Carter, his expression unreadable, but Camille could see it, the calculation, the gears shifting, the slow realization that his career had just taken a blow he might never recover from. Carter didn't move. Neither did Fuller. Neither did Graves. They sat there, frozen, as the consequences of their actions finally caught up with them. Camille gathered her things with steady hands, exhaling as she stood. The weight that had been pressing against her chest since the moment she had been dragged into that station was gone. It wasn't over, justice never came that easily, not for people like her. But today. Today was a victory. She walked toward the exit, her steps unhurried, unbothered. As she passed Carter, she paused just briefly, just long enough to murmur, "How does it feel?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what it felt like to be powerless. The echoes of the gavel still lingered in the air, but the shock had not yet settled. It gripped the room like an invisible force, holding everyone in a tense, suffocating silence. Judge Calloway had made his ruling, and the impact of that decision rippled through every person in the courtroom. Some sat frozen in disbelief, others whispered in hushed, frantic voices, as if afraid to speak too loudly, as if acknowledging the truth would make it more real. Brent Carter's body was stiff, his hands balled into fists on his lap, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed along his temple. He wasn't used to this. He had been trained to believe that no matter what happened, no matter how reckless or dishonest his actions were, he would always be protected. That was the unwritten law, the one that operated in the shadows of the real one, the one that had shielded officers like him for years. That illusion had just shattered, and he was struggling to grasp what came next. Shane Fuller shifted uncomfortably beside him, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. His fingers tapped anxiously against his knee, a nervous tic he hadn't realized was betraying his composure. He didn't want to look at Carter, didn't want to acknowledge the panic slowly creeping in. He had thought this trial would be over in an hour, a mere formality before they could go back to their normal lives. Now, the weight of reality was pressing down on him, and it felt unbearable. Tyler Graves, the quietest of the three, was the only one who seemed to recognize the gravity of what had just happened. His eyes darted to Hayward, who was still gripping the edges of the prosecution's table, his expression dark with fury. Hayward looked like a man who had been publicly stripped of everything he had built. The color in his face had drained, and his shoulders were locked so rigidly it seemed like he might snap at any second. He had spent years manipulating cases, bending the system to his will, but this? This was a public reckoning. Camille Warren stood tall, composed, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes, a fire that had not yet been extinguished. She had won, yes, but she knew this wasn't the end. Corruption didn't die in a single trial, and the men who had built their power on the backs of the innocent didn't crumble overnight. They would regroup. They would try to find ways to retaliate, to twist this in their favor. But today, they had lost. And that loss would haunt them. She took a slow step forward, the sound of her heels sharp against the cold marble floor. She approached the table where Hayward stood, watching as his fingers twitched slightly, his mask of control slipping with every second that passed. "You should have known better," she said, her voice quiet, yet filled with something deeper than anger. "You should have known this day would come." Hayward exhaled sharply through his nose, his nostrils flaring as he finally turned to look at her. His eyes burned with resentment, but beneath it, there was something else, something close to fear. He had underestimated her, and that mistake had cost him everything. "You think this changes anything?" he muttered under his breath, low enough that no one else could hear. "You think one trial, one ruling, undoes the system?" Camille studied him for a moment, tilting her head slightly. "No," she admitted. "But it's a start." His mouth twitched, the corner of his lip curling as if he wanted to sneer but no longer had the energy to do so. He had lost today, but men like him never truly admitted defeat. They just retreated, regrouped, and came back harder. She turned to the rookies, her gaze settling on Carter first. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his fingers gripping the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The arrogance was gone, replaced with something he didn't quite know how to process. He had never been on this side of the power dynamic before. He had never been the one under scrutiny. "How does it feel?" she asked, her voice even. Carter's throat bobbed as he swallowed, but he didn't answer. Camille took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "To know that the system won't protect you this time. To know that no one is going to step in and clean up your mess." Still, no answer. He was processing, or maybe he just didn't have the words. He had spent his whole life believing that consequences were for other people, that rules only applied to those who didn't carry a badge. Now, for the first time, he was being held accountable, and the weight of that realization was sinking in, pressing down on his chest like a vice. She turned to Fuller next. "You laughed that night," she said, watching as his eyes darted away from hers, as if he could escape the moment by refusing to meet her gaze. "You joked about what would happen to me. You thought it was funny." Fuller's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face darkening, but he said nothing. He had nothing to say. His words, the ones that had come so easily before, had dried up. "You all did," Camille continued, her gaze shifting between them. "Because you knew how this was supposed to go. You knew that the system would side with you, that no one would question your story. You've done it before, haven't you?" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Graves, the only one who hadn't spoken since the ruling, finally shifted. His voice was barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." Camille let out a slow, measured breath. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't. It was supposed to be routine. A quick arrest. A forced plea deal. A conviction that would fade into the endless list of others just like it. But this time, the system had made a mistake. They had gone after the wrong person." Judge Calloway cleared his throat from his bench, his patience wearing thin. "Officers Carter, Fuller, and Graves, you are to remain for official questioning. You will be placed on immediate suspension pending the outcome of the investigation." The finality of it hit like a hammer. Carter inhaled sharply, like the walls were closing in on him. Fuller let out a slow, controlled breath, like a man trying to steady himself before he fell apart. Graves simply nodded, his face unreadable. Camille stepped back, her part in this moment done. But as she moved toward the exit, she could feel the weight of their stares on her back. The unspoken questions, the resentment, the fear. This was the first time the system had turned on them, and they didn't know how to handle it. But Camille knew. She had spent her entire life knowing. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the crisp Alabama air, she inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years of injustice finally lift, if only just a little. This was not the end of the fight. But it was a victory. And sometimes, that was enough. The weight of what had just unfolded in that courtroom didn't lift easily. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around every person left in its wake. Even as Camille Warren walked out into the Alabama air, she could still feel the echoes of it pressing against her skin, the energy of something irrevocable shifting in the foundations beneath them. The courthouse doors shut behind her with a heavy finality, but the war wasn't over, it had simply changed shape. Inside, the room had not yet settled. Brent Carter sat motionless in his chair, his breath shallow, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand as though he were bracing himself against the inevitable. His entire body felt like it had locked in place, his mind reeling, searching for something, anything, to grasp onto. This was foreign. This feeling of helplessness, of vulnerability, of exposure. He had never known it before. Not like this. He had always been the one on the other side of the equation, watching as others crumbled under the weight of the system, knowing that it would never turn on him. Until now. Shane Fuller finally exhaled, the sound shaky, uneven. His fingers twitched against his thigh, his composure cracking like glass under pressure. He turned toward Carter, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell just happened?" Carter didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was stuck in the moment Camille Warren had looked at him, really looked at him, and made him see himself for what he was. He had thought power was permanent, that as long as he wore the badge, as long as he followed the rules written in the shadows, he would always be protected. But he had never considered what it would feel like when that protection was stripped away, when the people he had spent his entire career believing were beneath him suddenly stood over him. Douglas Hayward was the first to move, shoving his files into his briefcase with sharp, aggressive motions, the veins in his forehead bulging as he bit back the urge to explode. His career had been built on cases like this, on keeping the balance of power exactly where it had always been. And now? Now he had been humiliated, made a fool of in front of a jury, a judge, an entire courtroom. His teeth ground together as he turned toward Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, I urge you to reconsider." Calloway's voice was ice, sharp and cutting. "Enough." Hayward froze. The judge leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled, his expression carved from stone. He was not a man who enjoyed surprises, and today had been full of them. His voice was deliberate when he spoke again. "Mr. Hayward, you may be accustomed to bending the system to your advantage, but what happened today was not a courtroom trick. It was not manipulation. It was the exposure of something deeply flawed within our system, and I will not allow you to undermine it further." Hayward's mouth opened, then closed. He knew there was no arguing now. His carefully constructed web of control had snapped, and there was nothing left to hold on to. Judge Calloway turned his gaze toward the three officers still sitting at the prosecution's table, his expression unreadable. "Officers Carter, Fuller, and Graves, you are hereby placed on indefinite suspension pending the results of this investigation. You will surrender your badges and firearms immediately." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Fuller flinched. Graves exhaled sharply. Carter closed his eyes for half a second, his fingers pressing into the wood of the table so hard it left marks. Judge Calloway continued, his voice unwavering. "If the investigation finds sufficient evidence of misconduct, criminal charges will follow." Silence. The words hung there, suspended between them, carrying the weight of something none of them had ever believed possible. Accountability. Consequence. Hayward clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. He had known these men, trained them, molded them into the enforcers the system needed them to be. And now? Now they were being discarded like liabilities. Carter finally spoke, his voice low, uneven. "Your Honor." Calloway's gaze snapped to him, cold and unyielding. I suggest you use your words wisely, Officer Carter. Carter hesitated. His mind scrambled for something to say, something that would make this stop, that would turn back time to an hour ago when he had still been untouchable. But there was nothing. No rehearsed excuse. No easy exit. So he said nothing at all. The gavel came down one last time. Court was dismissed. The room erupted into movement, but Carter didn't move. His limbs felt foreign, disconnected from his body, his mind still processing the impossible. His badge, his shield, was gone. His protection, his power, everything he had built his identity on was crumbling beneath him, and he had no idea how to exist without it. Fuller was already on his feet, his movements jerky, unsteady. He turned to Carter, his voice a desperate whisper. "What do we do now?" Carter didn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. Outside the courthouse, Camille Warren stood beneath the gray Alabama sky, breathing in the cool air as if trying to cleanse herself of everything that had transpired inside. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. She had spent years in this fight, and she knew how the system worked. They would regroup. They would find new ways to protect themselves. But today, they had lost. And that loss was something they wouldn't soon forget. She turned as a figure approached her from the side, an older black man, dressed in a navy suit, his salt and pepper beard trimmed neatly. His name was Benjamin Cole, a retired civil rights attorney who had seen more of these cases than he cared to count. His eyes held wisdom, experience, but also something deeper, relief. "You did good today," Benjamin said, his voice warm but firm. Camille exhaled slowly. "It's not enough." Benjamin nodded. "No. But it's a start." She turned back toward the courthouse, watching as the men who had once thought themselves invincible were escorted out, their expressions dark, their futures uncertain. She could almost hear the thoughts racing in their minds, the panic, the confusion, the disbelief that the system had turned on them for once. She let them feel it. Let them sit in it. Because for once, they were the ones who had to answer for their actions. And that was a victory worth remembering. The sun was beginning to dip behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the pavement as Camille Warren stood outside, absorbing the magnitude of what had just taken place. The weight of it sat heavy on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder that justice, when it came, was never swift, never easy, and never guaranteed. Today had been a victory, but the war was far from over. She could feel the eyes on her, the whispers, the quiet disbelief that rippled through the crowd of onlookers who had gathered just beyond the steps. Some looked at her with admiration, others with resentment, and some with something deeper, a slow, dawning realization that the rules had changed. Benjamin Cole stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression thoughtful. He had seen many trials in his lifetime, had fought in countless battles just like this one, and yet, there was something different in his eyes now. Pride. Caution. A silent understanding that the consequences of today's ruling would extend far beyond the walls of that courtroom. "They're not gonna take this lying down," he murmured, his voice low, measured. Camille didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the courthouse doors. "I know. They'll come back harder," he continued. "People like Hayward, like Carter, they don't just walk away from something like this. They'll find another way." She exhaled slowly, nodding. "Let them try." Benjamin studied her for a moment, then let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "You really don't scare easy, do you?" Camille finally turned to him, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of her lips. "Not anymore." Before Benjamin could respond, the heavy wooden doors creaked open behind them. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as Brent Carter, Shane Fuller, and Tyler Graves stepped outside, escorted by court officers. They had been stripped of their badges, their weapons, and their authority. But what Camille noticed most wasn't the absence of their uniforms, it was the absence of their confidence. The arrogance, the certainty that had been so thick in the air when this had all started, was gone. Replaced by something raw, something unfamiliar. Carter's eyes found hers almost immediately. He stopped just short of the top step, his face tight, unreadable, but his breathing uneven. There was no fury in his expression, no threats lingering behind his gaze. Just something Camille had never seen from him before. Doubt. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't sure of his own power anymore. A man who had spent his entire career believing in his own invincibility, only to have that belief shattered in front of an entire courtroom. Fuller, standing just behind him, was less composed. His fists were clenched at his sides, his jaw locked so tightly Camille could almost hear the teeth grinding together. He wasn't just shaken, he was furious. Furious at being exposed. Furious at being stripped of his shield. Furious that, for once, he was the one being judged. Graves, as usual, said nothing. His posture was rigid, his face unreadable. But Camille could see it in his eyes, the quiet calculation of a man trying to determine whether this was the end of his career or just a temporary setback. Carter finally took a step forward, stopping just a few feet from her. The officers escorting him remained close, as if they weren't sure whether to intervene. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Carter inhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You really think this changes anything?" Camille arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. "Doesn't it?" Carter's nostrils flared, his fists clenching before he exhaled, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled breath. "You got lucky today." She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "No, Carter. You got careless." His jaw twitched. "You thought no one would question you," she continued. "You thought your badge made you untouchable. That you could do whatever you wanted, say whatever you wanted, and the system would clean up the mess for you." Carter's eyes darkened. "That's how it works." "Not anymore." A beat of silence stretched between them. Fuller took a step forward now, his anger barely restrained. "You think you won? You think this means something?" His voice was sharp, edged with something dangerous. "This doesn't change the world, Warren. You didn't fix anything." Camille turned her gaze toward him, calm, unreadable. "I didn't have to fix the world, Fuller. I just had to fix today." Fuller scoffed, shaking his head. "You humiliated us." Camille's lips parted slightly, a hint of amusement in her expression. "Did I?" Her voice was almost too quiet, too even. "Or did you do that to yourselves?" Fuller's face twisted in frustration, but before he could respond, Carter spoke again, his voice lower this time, more controlled. "You think this is justice?" Camille's eyes didn't waver. "I think this is accountability." Carter looked away for a moment, his hands still curled into tight fists. When he finally met her gaze again, there was something different in his expression. Something Camille couldn't quite place. "You think this stops here?" His voice was quieter now, almost contemplative. "You think they're just gonna let this happen?" Camille didn't blink. "I think if they try to undo this, they'll learn the same lesson you did today." Carter let out a slow breath, glancing toward the crowd, the reporters, the people watching this unfold with rapt attention. He wasn't used to this, the feeling of being the story instead of writing it. The feeling of being questioned instead of doing the questioning. Behind him, Hayward emerged from the courthouse, his face thunderous. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't acknowledge the crowd. He walked past the officers, past Camille, his movements stiff with barely restrained fury. His career had taken a hit today. A very public one. And men like Hayward didn't take losses lightly. Camille turned back to Carter, studying him carefully. "What happens next is up to you," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. Carter exhaled sharply, something shifting in his gaze, something that resembled uncertainty. "Not defeat. Not yet." but the seed of something close. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned, following the court officers as they led him and the others down the courthouse steps. The crowd murmured. The cameras flashed. Benjamin let out a slow breath beside Camille, shaking his head. That was something. Camille hummed in agreement, but her mind was still working, still turning over the pieces, the consequences, the unknown variables that would follow. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She had won today. But tomorrow? Tomorrow was another battle. The fallout from the trial did not settle quietly. The shockwave spread far beyond the courtroom, rippling through the department, the legal system, and the public eye. What had once been an open-and-shut case, a mere formality in the cycle of unchecked power, had become something else entirely, a moment of reckoning. It was no longer just about Camille Warren. It was about every name that had been buried in files marked "justified," about every case that had never seen the light of day. And now, the light was shining directly on the men who thought they were untouchable. Brent Carter's career was over. The internal investigation confirmed what had already been exposed: falsified reports, fabricated probable cause, excessive force. The evidence was undeniable, and without the shield of silence that had always protected him, he had no choice but to resign in disgrace. His reputation, once a shining promise within the department, was reduced to a cautionary tale. He had spent his career believing he was above the law, and now he would spend the rest of his life learning what it felt like to live under it. He had been offered a deal: resign quietly, avoid criminal charges, but the weight of his choices didn't vanish with the stroke of a pen. His name would never carry the same power again. Shane Fuller didn't go down so easily. His anger, the unrelenting need to believe he had been wronged, drove him to fight back. He protested his suspension, attempted to sue for wrongful termination, argued that the trial had been manipulated against him. But the world had changed in ways he hadn't foreseen. The same system that had once protected him now had no use for him. His case was dismissed, his credibility shattered. No department wanted him, no precinct would take the risk. He had burned every bridge, and when the realization finally set in, he disappeared into the background, another man who had believed himself too powerful to fall, only to find that power had always been borrowed, never his to keep. Tyler Graves was different. He was the only one who had truly understood what had happened in that courtroom. He hadn't spoken much during the trial, but in the weeks that followed, his silence grew into something heavier, something filled with unspoken regret. He hadn't been the loudest, the cruelest, the most reckless. But he had stood by and watched. He had participated. And in the end, that was enough to bring him down with the others. He left the force before they could push him out, quietly fading from the life he had once built. There were whispers that he had moved to another city, that he had tried to start over. But no matter where he went, the past followed. He had seen what justice looked like up close, and he knew, deep down, that he had been standing on the wrong side of it. Douglas Hayward, the man who had once controlled the courtroom with absolute certainty, found himself drowning in the very system he had used to destroy others. His credibility was shredded, his influence diminished. He had tried to recover, to maneuver his way back into favor, but the stain of his failure was too deep. The legal world moved on without him. The men he had once called allies distanced themselves, unwilling to attach their names to his disgrace. His career, built on decades of unchecked power, had been dismantled in a single trial. He was left with nothing but the realization that, for once, the rules he had manipulated had turned against him. And Camille Warren? She thrived. The case had made her name a force to be reckoned with, but it wasn't just about her personal victory. It was about what came next. She had always known that justice was never a single moment, never a single trial. It was a relentless pursuit, a fight that never truly ended. The exposure of corruption in the department led to broader investigations, sweeping changes that forced the system to reckon with itself. Officers who had operated under the assumption that they were above scrutiny suddenly found themselves under the microscope. The conversations that followed were uncomfortable, necessary, long overdue. Camille continued her work, but now, she was more than just a judge. She was a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that power was not absolute, that accountability was possible. She was invited to speak across the country, to educate, to challenge, to push the system in ways it had resisted for far too long. And she did it all with the same unwavering presence she had carried in that courtroom, the same quiet force that had turned the tide in a battle no one thought could be won. But she never let herself believe it was over. Justice, real justice, was never a destination. It was a road that stretched endlessly ahead. And as long as there were those who sought to corrupt it, to silence the truth, she would be there, ready. Because this fight was never just hers. And it never would be. Now, let's talk about what just happened. What do you think power really is? Is it something given, something inherited, or something taken? The men in this story believed that power meant immunity. That as long as they had the system on their side, as long as they had the right connections, the right uniforms, the right courtroom, they could do whatever they wanted. They weren't just shocked when the system turned against them, they were lost. Because they had never imagined a world where the rules applied to them too. But that's the thing about justice. It doesn't work unless it applies to everyone. So now, I want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Did you expect things to end the way they did? And more importantly, what would you have done if you were in Camille's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is a conversation that matters. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge, that twist, that make you think, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, turn on your notifications, and join us for the next story. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.